A trade war begins when one country imposes taxes, known as tariffs, on goods imported from another nation. This is not a friendly economic gesture, it is a calculated act of economic coercion. The targeted country often responds in kind, raising its own tariffs, escalating into retaliation. The cycle of retaliation becomes a full-blown trade war. When governments disrupt trade flows, ordinary citizens feel it, so do multinational corporations alike. We'll use a chart-led approach to demystify this. Effects will break down: gross domestic product, the rate of inflation, and the performance of specific economic sectors. Our aim: clear, factual, accessible explanations using real-world examples. Mechanisms will explain: tariffs, quotas, non-tariff barriers. Case studies: United States versus China, United States versus European Union, India versus China. Each case examined by its national economic impact. The primary weapon in a trade war is the tariff tax levied on imported goods. When country A imposes a 25% tariff on steel from country B, the price of that steel for buyers in country A increases significantly. This makes locally produced steel more competitive in price, theoretically boosting domestic steel manufacturers. However, this is just the first move in a complex game. Country B will almost certainly retaliate, perhaps by placing a tariff on agricultural products from country A. This tit-for-tat escalation is the defining characteristic of a trade war, creating a vicious cycle of protectionism that harms both economies more than it helps. Flowchart illustrating: A imposes tariffs, prices rise; B retaliates, trade drops. Quotas are a direct limit on the quantity of a specific good that can be imported. For instance, a country might decree that only 100,000 cars can be imported from another nation per year. Another powerful tool is the non-tariff barrier. Complex regulations, stringent quality standards, slow customs procedures designed to make importing difficult and costly. These barriers can be even more disruptive than tariffs because they create uncertainty and administrative burdens for businesses trying to sell their products abroad, effectively choking off trade without explicitly taxing it. These measures disrupt finely tuned global supply chains. The impact on supply chains is one of the most significant and lasting consequences of a trade war. A modern smartphone, for example, contains components sourced from dozens of countries. A tariff on a single critical part from one country can force a company to redesign its entire product, or more drastically, relocate its manufacturing operations. This process is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. Firms must find new suppliers, build new factories, and retrain workers. This reshuffling of global production lines introduces massive inefficiencies into the global economy, ultimately leading to higher costs for consumers and lower profits for companies that were once highly efficient. The trade war between the United States and China, which escalated significantly starting in 2018, is one of the most consequential economic conflicts of the 21st century. The US initiated the conflict by imposing sweeping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, machinery, electronics, furniture, apparel. The stated rationale was to combat perceived unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer. China swiftly responded with its own set of retaliatory tariffs: soybeans, automobiles, aircraft. This direct confrontation sent shockwaves through the global financial system. The scale of the trade war was unprecedented in the modern era. Tariffs affected products central to global supply chains. American tech giants that relied on Chinese factories for assembly and component manufacturing then faced higher costs and disrupted production models. Chinese manufacturers who depended on the massive US consumer market saw their orders plummet. The conflict spilled into the technology sector. US restrictions on Chinese tech companies like Huawei, citing national security concerns, which further deepened the economic divide between the two powers. Companies reconsidered strategies overnight, exploring moves to Vietnam, Malaysia, a strategy known as China Plus One, despite significant capital expenditure and logistical challenges. The conflict highlighted deep interdependence. While the US sought to reduce its trade deficit with China, untangling the two economies proved complex and painful. US consumers had grown accustomed to low prices of Chinese goods. Businesses relied on Chinese manufacturing for competitiveness. For China, the US market fueled export revenue and growth. In a deeply integrated global economy, there are no easy victories, only mutual damage. In the United States, several studies concluded the tariffs led to a modest drag on GDP growth. Higher costs for imported goods and raw materials squeezed margins, cutting investment and hiring. Changes in US import prices by category from China before and after 2018 tariffs. Retaliatory tariffs hit US exporters, especially agriculture, pulling down exports, a GDP component. The effect on inflation was direct. Tariffs are taxes, often passed to households as higher prices. Washing machines, luggage, bicycles, electronics saw noticeable price hikes. Overall, inflation didn't skyrocket, but increases were concentrated and hit lower and middle-income families harder. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimated tariffs cost the average household several $100s per year. Winners and losers emerged across sectors. Steel and aluminum manufacturing saw short-term boosts, but those gains were offset elsewhere. US agriculture was a major loser. Soybeans, pork, other farm products collapsed in exports. Automakers faced higher input costs. Tech firms faced supply chain disruptions. Policies designed to help one sector often hurt others, making the net benefit questionable. For China, tariffs slowed export growth and moderated GDP, acting as a brake on an export-oriented model. Manufacturing hubs like Guangdong saw many low-margin factories shut and job losses. Policy steps, modest RMB depreciation, domestic stimulus, tax cuts, infrastructure spending, a pivot to domestic consumption. The tech war spurred moves toward technological self-sufficiency, especially semiconductors. Firms diversified beyond the US, Southeast Asia, Europe, Belt and Road routes, while a GDP line graph marks the 2018 tariff shock. The trade relationship between the United States and the European Union is deep and multifaceted, but not without friction. Unlike the broad US-China conflict, US-EU disputes are more targeted. Aircraft subsidies, Boeing and Airbus, led the WTO to authorize retaliatory tariffs on aircraft and goods like wine, cheese, and machinery. In 2018, US steel and aluminum tariffs met EU retaliation on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, bourbon whiskey, and blue jeans. Economic effects were concentrated in targeted sectors. Macro impacts on GDP and inflation were minimal. Yet individual producers faced severe consequences. Reliance on WTO rules offered an off-ramp. In 2021, both sides suspended aircraft-related tariffs to refocus on common challenges. This pause showed that diplomacy can still work. The trade relationship between India and China is marked by a large, persistent deficit, with Chinese electronics, machinery, and pharmaceutical ingredients embedded in India's economy. Geopolitical tensions, including border disputes, prompted India to tighten scrutiny, add non-tariff barriers, and curb investment. Dozens of Chinese apps, including TikTok, were banned. India pushed Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat to build local supply chains in electronics and pharma. Some domestic producers gained. Many SMEs relying on low-cost Chinese inputs faced higher costs, delays, and inflation in some segments. GDP effects are hard to isolate. Self-reliance needs long-term investment. In the short run, there are winners and losers, underscoring a trade-off between efficiency and strategic autonomy. When the dust settles in a trade war, clear long-term winners are rare. The notion of winning is misleading. The conflict damages all sides. Immediate beneficiaries, a few protected industries, and a bump in government tariff revenue. But gains are narrow, concentrated, and short-lived. Top of the losers list, consumers. Tariff costs are passed on as higher prices, reducing purchasing power, hitting low-income families most. Exporters suffer retaliation, sometimes unrelated to the original dispute, leading to lost revenue, layoffs, and reduced competitiveness. The biggest loser is economic efficiency. Supply chains optimized over decades are disrupted, raising costs and lowering productivity. Some firms may gain briefly behind tariff walls, but the global economy becomes poorer, less productive, more fragmented. In this sense, everyone bears a cost. Trade wars are blunt and costly instruments of policy. Across US, China, the EU, and India, tariffs raise consumer prices, disrupt businesses, and drag on growth. While a few sectors gain short-term protection, retaliation inflicts widespread collateral damage. The lesson: tariffs and other barriers create a more uncertain, less efficient global economy, with costs borne by households and competitive exporters. Governments should commit to negotiation and de-escalation, using the WTO and formal forums rather than unilateral actions. When industries struggle, use targeted support, worker retraining, and investments in new technology, instead of broad tariffs. Foster resilience through supplier diversification and transparent regulations, not inefficient self-sufficiency. For businesses, map supply chains, identify concentration risks, diversify suppliers, and hedge currency and price volatility. Invest in innovation and productivity. Resilience, not just efficiency, is the new imperative. Trade wars have no true victors. Wealth is created not through isolation, but through connection. Economic cooperation is not weakness, but the surest path to shared prosperity.